My lawyer wrote to me, "Call me immediately." He told me the truth about my son that I never expected, and from that moment, everything in my life began to move in a new direction. That single message, urgent and heavy, opened a door I had never imagined, one that would lead me toward a revelation powerful enough to shape not only that day, but all that was yet to unfold. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. My lawyer's words carried the kind of weight that no father should ever have to bear. I was sitting in my chair that afternoon, the light of the sun coming through the window, when I heard the buzz of my phone. The message was simple, direct, and filled with urgency. In that instant, I knew it was not about routine paperwork or formalities. It was something deeper, something that demanded I take notice. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, my heart beginning to beat harder than it had in years. In all my long life, through struggles and sacrifices, I thought I had seen everything, but this was different. It was as if the world around me slowed down, leaving only the words on that screen and the echo of my lawyer's voice in my mind, waiting for me to pick up the phone. I had trusted him for years, through matters of property, inheritance, and family disputes. Never once had he sent me a message so sharp, so commanding. I rose from my chair, each step across the floor feeling heavier, as though I were walking into a storm I could not yet see. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the phone, not from weakness but from the strange anticipation that comes before a truth you cannot yet name. The silence in the house was thick, broken only by the ticking of the clock, reminding me of how quickly time moves when decisions wait. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than seconds. And I thought of my son, his face, his voice, the years we shared. I thought of the times I had guided him, worked for him, believed in him. And then I pressed the call button, not yet knowing that the words about to reach my ears would change not only my view of him, but the entire course of my life. I still remember the moment I saw that message on my phone, but what followed was even more striking. The subject line of the email was short and urgent, carrying a weight that pressed down on me before I had even read the words inside. My lawyer had written only one thing in bold letters: "Call me immediately." Nothing else. No explanation, no softening detail. Just those words, waiting like a locked door I was afraid to open. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, my old hands resting on the wood as memories of past conversations with him flickered through my mind. He had always been a careful man, measured with his words, never one to exaggerate or stir worry without reason. That made his urgency all the more unsettling. I leaned closer, my eyes narrowing, the glow of the screen reflecting against the glasses perched on my nose. My heart began to thump, steady but stronger, as if reminding me that something of importance was coming. The air in the room felt heavier, the kind of weight that comes before a storm, though the day outside was calm and filled with light. I thought back to the decades of trust we had shared, the documents he prepared for me, the guidance he gave with quiet certainty. For him to write to me in such a way meant only one thing. Something had shifted, and I needed to face it. I clicked the message open, but there were no further words, only his number highlighted, as though to say he could not put the truth in writing. That detail, small but sharp, told me more than any sentence could. Whatever it was not meant for paper or screen. It was meant for my ears alone. I sat back, my chair creaking, the old wood of the desk beneath my hand grounding me as I breathed slow and steady. My eyes lifted to the framed photographs on the wall, pictures of my son through the years, from a boy clutching a ball to a young man in a suit standing proud, to more recent times where his eyes seemed harder, less open. I studied them, one by one, as if they might give me an answer to what I was about to hear. My lawyer's message was clear. This was not business as usual. This was a matter that would carve itself into my life forever. I took the phone in my hand and prepared to hear the words waiting for me. When I finally pressed the call button, the silence in the room seemed to stretch across the walls, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing as the line began to ring. Each tone was a reminder that something waited for me on the other side, and as soon as my lawyer answered, his voice carried the same urgency that I had already felt in the message. He did not greet me in his usual calm manner. He did not waste a second with pleasantries. His words came firm, measured, and heavy. He told me he had uncovered something about my son that demanded my attention at once. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles pressing pale against the surface, and leaned forward as if the act of leaning might help me hold on to every detail of what he was saying. His voice was clear, steady, yet laced with a gravity that no father wants to hear. He explained that while reviewing certain documents, he had found evidence suggesting my son had been acting behind my back, making moves that should not have been possible without my knowledge. The words poured into my ears like cold water, and I sat frozen, my other hand flat on the desk, grounding myself as if the wood could keep me steady. I asked him to repeat what he said, not because I had not heard, but because I could not believe the weight of his words. He did so, slower this time, and with each word I felt the room grow smaller, the air heavier. My lawyer assured me that he would not have called if it were anything less than serious, and he explained how certain attempts had been made to alter legal documents tied to property and estate, attempts that carried my son's name. I listened quietly, my mind flashing back to the many times I had trusted my son, the years of sacrifice, the lessons I thought I had passed down. To hear that he had been involved in such a scheme struck me deeper than I can describe, yet in that moment I did not let my lawyer hear despair in my voice. Instead, I kept calm, asking him to send me every piece of information he had, every document, every detail. My voice was steady, though inside me a storm had begun to rise, the kind of storm that does not break at once but grows, waiting for the moment it must. After that call, I sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the words pressing into me. But as the hours stretched, my mind did what it always did in times of crisis. It wandered back to the beginning, to the years when I was younger, when my body was strong and my days were filled with labor. I thought about how everything I had built, every brick, every field, every investment, had been shaped by sacrifice. I remembered the sweat that stung my eyes as I worked long hours, the calluses that formed on my hands, and the aching in my bones that came from never allowing myself to rest too long. All of it was done with one vision in mind, the hope of giving my son a life better than the one I had known. I remembered my wife's gentle smile as she stood in the doorway watching me come home late in the evening, her voice soft but full of pride, telling me that our hard work would be worth it. Together, we raised our son with every ounce of care we had, never letting him go hungry, never letting him feel the absence of comfort. I saved when others spent. I gave up pleasures so that he could study, so that he could wear good clothes, so that he could walk through life without the struggles I had endured. Every decision was a trade, my comfort for his future, my strength for his opportunity. And for years, I thought it was enough. I thought I had passed to him not only the fruits of my labor, but also the values that guided me, the respect for honesty, the gratitude for sacrifice, the patience to build a life brick by brick. As I sat at my desk recalling those years, I could still see the small boy running across the yard, calling to me with joy, his arms stretched out. I could still hear the laughter at the dinner table when we had little but found happiness in each other's company. Those memories pressed against the words of my lawyer like sunlight against a storm cloud, but the contrast was sharp. To think that the same boy, now grown, would be tied to such betrayal cut deep into the heart of all I had built. Still, as I remembered those sacrifices, I found within myself a strength I had always carried, a quiet resolve that told me the story was not finished, and that my years of endurance had prepared me for the trial to come. As I sat in the quiet of that evening, my mind began to sift through memories that I had once brushed aside, and I realized there had been signs all along, small sparks that hinted at the fire now burning in front of me. I remembered the way my son would speak to me in his younger years, not always with the warmth I expected, but with a tone that carried impatience, as though my words slowed him down. When he grew older, that impatience turned into arrogance, a sharp edge that revealed itself in conversations where he spoke more of what he deserved than what he had earned. There were moments when he would demand money rather than request it, his words heavy with entitlement, and I, blinded by my love as a father, excused it as youthful recklessness. I told myself he would grow out of it, that with time he would understand the weight of sacrifice and the importance of respect. Yet the signs grew clearer as the years passed. He would dismiss my advice, cutting me off mid-sentence with the certainty that he knew better. He would roll his eyes at the values I tried to instill, mocking the patience and humility that had guided my entire life. I remembered one day when he stood in front of me, tall and proud, telling me that I worked too hard for too little, that the world did not reward men like me anymore, and that he would never waste his life in the same way. Those words had stung, though I swallowed the pain and smiled faintly, convincing myself it was only the boldness of youth speaking. I even recall moments at family gatherings where he would boast of what he planned to achieve, speaking more of wealth and control than of gratitude or love. At the time, I looked past it, choosing to focus on the hope that he would one day see the truth in the values we had lived by. Now, with the lawyer's words still echoing in my ears, I realized that arrogance and entitlement were not passing shadows, but signs of a path he had chosen long ago. They were not mistakes to be corrected with time, but seeds that had taken root in his heart, shaping the man he had become. And as I sat with those memories, I knew that what I had once dismissed as impatience was the early glimpse of something far greater that I now had to face. In the days after the call, as I turned over the words my lawyer had spoken, I began to see not only my son's choices, but also the influence of those around him, and one face in particular came to mind. His wife had always been clever with her words, polite when needed, yet behind her smile I often sensed a quiet calculation. I remember the first time she came into our home, carrying herself with grace, her voice sweet, her manner respectful, but her eyes sharp, always moving, always watching. In the early days I welcomed her, hopeful that she would bring love and stability to my son's life, and perhaps soften his sharper edges. But with time, I noticed changes, subtle at first, then more direct. My son began to echo her phrases, her ideas slipping into his conversations until they became his own. She would whisper to him during family discussions, and afterward his tone with me would shift, firmer, colder, as though my opinion carried less weight. I watched her encourage his pride, feeding the belief that he was destined for greater things, that he deserved more than what was given to him, more than what I had built with my hands and guarded with my years. There were moments when I caught her glancing at the photographs of our properties on the walls, her eyes lingering not on the memories they held but on the wealth they represented. I told myself I was imagining it, that she was simply admiring the family history, but my heart knew better. It became clear over time that she saw me not as a father-in-law to be respected, but as an obstacle standing between her and the life she dreamed of living. I would hear her speak softly to my son about investments, about control, about inheritance, planting thoughts in his mind that took root and grew stronger with each passing year. Slowly he began to see me less as the man who had raised him and more as the barrier to the riches he believed were already his. And though it pained me to admit it, I knew that her influence had sharpened his greed and hardened his arrogance, turning what had once been youthful impatience into deliberate ambition. Sitting in my chair, recalling their voices, their whispers, and their glances, I understood that this was not a path my son had walked alone. It was a path built by the words of those who stood beside him, guiding him further away from me and deeper into betrayal. The day my lawyer laid out the truth in full detail, I listened with a stillness that only years of endurance could bring. His words came slow, deliberate, each one cutting into the silence of my study. He explained that while reviewing legal files, he discovered attempts to alter documents connected to my estate. Papers that should have remained untouched now bore traces of tampering, with changes designed to shift control from me into my son's hands. The language was subtle, the kind of phrasing that only a trained eye could catch, yet the intention behind it was unmistakable. My son had not waited for my passing, had not respected the natural order of life and inheritance. Instead, he had worked quietly, in secret, to move my properties and assets under his own name. The lawyer told me that such attempts were dangerous, not only because of the betrayal they represented, but because they revealed planning. This was not a passing mistake or a careless error. This was deliberate. He told me how the documents showed signs of manipulation. Signatures that had been copied, clauses that had been rewritten to give my son power over what was never his to claim. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, my eyes fixed on the shelves of books in front of me, each one a reminder of knowledge and patience gathered over the years. The lawyer's voice carried on, steady, professional, but I heard in his tone the unspoken truth. He was not only speaking to me as a client, he was speaking to me as a man, a father, warning me of the storm that had already begun. I asked him to send copies of everything, to gather evidence, and he assured me that he already had. He said he had secured files, photographed the documents, and traced the attempts back to my son's own requests. There was no mistake. There was no doubt. The evidence pointed directly to him. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening not only to my lawyer's words, but to the echoes of my own past. The years of trust I had placed in my son, the sacrifices I had made for him, now sat beside the truth of what he had done. The revelation was sharp, yet within me I felt not despair but clarity. I now understood the depth of his actions, and I knew the path forward would require strength, patience, and a will as steady as stone. That night after my lawyer's revelation, I sat alone in the dim light of my study. The house quiet except for the steady tick of the clock on the wall, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had learned. The betrayal was not a single act, sudden and unexpected, but something that had been growing in silence for years, carefully hidden beneath the mask of family ties. I thought back to the moments when my son smiled at me, shook my hand, or placed an arm around my shoulder, and now I could not help but see those gestures in a different light. Each memory felt like a shadow, hiding something sharp beneath the surface. I realized then that his betrayal was not born in an instant, but was the result of long planning, deliberate steps taken to strip me of control while I still breathed. The thought cut deeply, not only because of the deceit itself, but because it revealed how little he valued the bond between us. The man I had raised, the boy I had carried in my arms, had been preparing to take from me, not with honesty, but with quiet calculation. I could see the shape of it now, how each of his words in recent years had been layered with more meaning than I noticed at the time. The questions about property, the sudden interest in documents, the insistence on knowing details about accounts and holdings, all of it had been preparation, pieces of a puzzle that now fit together too clearly to ignore. And I remembered the look in his eyes at family dinners, a certain restlessness, as though his thoughts were not on the food or the laughter, but on what he believed was already his. The pain of that realization was sharp, but in its sharpness came clarity. I knew now that what my lawyer had uncovered was not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, but a choice made with intention. My son's betrayal was a quiet theft of trust, carried out not in haste, but with patience, as though he had been waiting for the moment I would falter so he could step forward and claim what was never his. Sitting there, in the silence, I felt the ache of loss, not of wealth, but of the bond I once believed unbreakable. And yet beneath that ache was the beginning of something stronger, a resolve that told me I would not allow his deceit to go unanswered. After hearing the truth from my lawyer, I knew I could not move blindly, for emotions alone would not protect me. I needed to gather proof, to hold in my hands the evidence of what had been done. And so with his guidance, we began a careful process that would reveal everything hidden in the shadows. My lawyer sent me copies of the altered documents, each one marked with his notes, pointing to the lines that had been changed, the signatures that bore signs of imitation, the clauses rewritten to tilt control into my son's hands. I spread them out across my desk, the papers whispering against one another as I studied them in the quiet of the night. My eyes traced every word, my hands steady though my heart felt the burn of betrayal with each detail. Over the following weeks, my lawyer arranged access to records, tracing back communications, uncovering who had made the requests and from where they had come. Each discovery was like another stone added to the weight already pressing on my chest. Yet I bore it with patience, for I knew that in truth lay my strength. I kept my silence with my family, showing no sign of what I knew, but in secret I collected everything, storing copies in a locked drawer, each folder a shield against the storm that was brewing. At times I would sit for hours, staring at the papers, my mind drifting to memories of my son's laughter as a child, only to be pulled back into the cold reality of his signature scrawled across a stolen future. My lawyer guided me step by step, explaining what each piece of evidence meant, how it fit into the larger scheme, and why it was essential to gather every thread before confronting him. With each revelation, I felt the bond between father and son grow thinner, stretched to the point of breaking, yet I held it quietly, not letting anger consume me. For what mattered most now was not the pain, but the plan. In those long nights, with papers spread before me and the sound of the clock ticking steady on the wall, I came to understand that betrayal is not defeated by words spoken in haste, but by patience, by preparation, by the strength to wait until the moment arrives when truth can no longer be denied. And so I gathered, piece by piece, building not only a case but a shield that would protect all that I had worked for. As the evidence began to gather in my drawer, I found myself drifting back into memories that I had long buried, moments that seemed small at the time but now stood as warnings I had chosen to ignore. I remembered the times when my son would raise his voice at me, not with the playfulness of youth, but with the sharpness of someone who had little regard for patience. He would dismiss my words with a wave of his hand, as though years of experience meant nothing compared to his own fleeting thoughts. There was the evening when I tried to teach him about saving, showing him the value of patience and steady growth, and he laughed, telling me that I was too cautious, that real success came only from bold risks and quick gains. That laughter still echoed in my mind, not of joy but of disregard, and though it hurt, I let it pass at the time, convincing myself that he would one day understand. I remembered another day when he came home with friends, their voices loud, their attitudes careless, and he introduced me as though I were not his father, but simply the man who paid the bills. I stood in silence that day, choosing not to correct him, because I thought my love would outweigh his disrespect. There were dinners where he sat at the table staring into his phone, ignoring the stories I tried to share, stories of my own struggles, of how his mother and I built our lives brick by brick. He would roll his eyes and change the subject as if our sacrifices were relics of another world, unworthy of his time. And there was the time, sharp in my memory, when he told me outright that the only thing that mattered was what he would inherit, that his future was already written in the wealth I had created. I should have taken those words as a warning, but I told myself it was arrogance of youth, a temporary blindness that life would correct. Now, with the papers spread across my desk, those memories struck with clarity, each one a stone laid upon the path that led to this moment. His mockery of patience, his dismissal of respect, his fixation on what he believed he was owed, all of it had pointed to this truth. What I once brushed aside as fleeting insolence was, in fact, the steady unveiling of a heart turned away from the values I tried to instill. In the quiet that followed those nights of study, when the papers lay stacked neatly in their folders, and my lawyer's steady voice still echoed in my ear, I felt something within me shift. At first it was grief, heavy and cold, pressing against my chest as I thought of the son I had raised and the years I had spent building a future for him. Yet slowly, that grief hardened into something else, something firmer, like stone taking shape beneath water. It became resolve. I knew then that I could not let this betrayal pass unchecked, for silence would only give him power and strip me of the dignity I had earned through decades of sacrifice. I rose from my chair and walked the length of my study, my hands clasped behind my back, my steps steady, each one echoing against the floor as though marking the rhythm of my decision. I had endured storms before. Poverty in my youth, loss of loved ones, the endless weight of labor that left my body scarred and worn. Each trial had tested me, and each one I had overcome with patience and quiet strength. Now I understood that this betrayal, sharp as it was, would be no different. I would not fall beneath it. I would rise through it. My lawyer had given me the first tools, but it was my will that would see the task through. I looked at the photographs on the wall, the faces of family, my wife's gentle smile, my younger self standing beside the house we built with our own hands, and I felt their presence like a reminder that I was not alone in this fight. They had all given me their strength once, and now I would use that strength to protect what was rightfully mine. I told myself, not aloud but deep within my heart, that I would not let anger guide me. Anger burns quickly, leaving nothing behind. No, what I needed was patience, the same patience that had carried me through years of work, the same patience that had built the life my son now sought to take. With that patience I would plan, and with that resolve I would act. In that moment, standing in the dim light of my study, I made a vow as firm as stone. I would protect my legacy. I would defend the truth, and I would not rest until justice was served. Once the weight of my resolve had settled, the path before me began to take shape, and together with my lawyer, we started to build a strategy as carefully as I had once built my home brick by brick. He told me that the first step was to secure my estate, to place barriers that no one could cross without my knowledge. He guided me through legal protections, drafting documents that would lock every property, every account, every asset under safeguards too strong for my son to pierce. I sat with him in his office, the smell of old paper filling the air, as he laid out the steps one by one. He explained how power of attorney could be revoked, how trusts could be adjusted, how the law itself could be made my shield if only we moved carefully and quietly. I listened with patience, nodding at each instruction, knowing that haste would serve my son's advantage, but patience would serve mine. At home, I kept my composure, showing nothing of what I knew, speaking to my son as though life continued as it always had. I let him believe he still held the upper hand, while in truth each passing day drew the walls tighter around me, leaving him no space to strike. My lawyer and I met often, sometimes in his office, sometimes in quiet corners where no familiar face would pass, and we spoke in low tones, planning for every possibility. He gathered not only documents, but witnesses, preparing statements from those who had seen my son's behavior, voices that could be called upon if the matter went before the courts. I felt a strange calm during those days, not the calm of peace, but the calm of purpose, like the steady hands of a craftsman fitting stone into place. My lawyer reminded me often that we must not show our hand too early, that patience would lure my son into growing bold, and boldness would reveal more than secrecy ever could. I understood this well. For years I had built through endurance, and now I would fight through endurance too. Each night I would sit in my study, the papers locked away beside me, and I would trace the plan in my mind like a map, every step laid clear before me. It was not anger that guided me, nor sorrow, but the quiet certainty that I would not allow betrayal to consume me. My strategy was simple but strong. Protect what is mine, expose what is false, and wait for the moment when truth itself would rise and leave no room for denial. In the weeks that followed, I carried myself with the face of a man unaware, letting each day pass as though I had never received the message, never held the papers, never spoken the words with my lawyer. I greeted my son with the same steady tone, listened to his stories, nodded at his ambitions, and let him believe the ground beneath him was still firm. I knew well the danger of revealing my hand too early, for arrogance is a fire that grows only when given air, and I wanted his arrogance to burn bright enough to expose all that he was hiding. At family dinners, I kept my eyes calm, watching as he grew more confident, speaking with a certainty that he already controlled what was mine. He would make small remarks, testing the waters, asking about properties as though they were already under his care, speaking of accounts as though they were already in his name. I gave him no hint of my knowledge. I let him believe his words passed over me like a breeze, unnoticed and unchallenged. Inside, I studied every phrase, every glance between him and his wife, every subtle sign that confirmed what my lawyer had shown me. I carried the weight of silence with the strength of a man who has endured much, and though it was not easy, I knew silence itself was my sharpest tool. In the quiet hours of night I would sit in my study with the papers spread before me, tracing the lines with my finger, reminding myself that patience was the key. My son thought himself clever, thought his schemes invisible, but each day he only drew tighter into the net he could not yet see. I could hear in his voice the rising confidence of a man who believed he had already won, and I knew that was the moment to wait for. Let him believe, let him boast, let him think his path is clear. For the more certain he became, the deeper he would step into the very trap laid by his own greed. I kept my calm, moving through each day with steady hands and a quiet heart, waiting for the moment when the silence would break. In that waiting I found strength, for every act of patience was not weakness but preparation, and with each passing hour I grew more certain that when the truth finally came, it would arrive with a force no lie could withstand. It was not long before the silence I kept began to feed his boldness, and soon my son's confidence grew into direct demands that he no longer tried to hide. One evening, he came to me with a firmness in his voice, asking about properties as though they already belonged to him. His words sharp with expectation rather than respect. He spoke of accounts, of deeds, of holdings, and he pressed me for access, insisting that the time had come for him to manage what he believed was his future. I listened quietly, my face calm, my eyes steady, and I gave him only measured replies, neither granting nor denying, letting him believe I was still the same old man who had always yielded to his impatience. But inside, each demand was another stone laid upon the wall of betrayal, and I could see clearly now how far he had stepped from the boy I once held in my arms. His wife sat beside him that evening, her eyes sharp, her smile thin, nodding with approval at every word he spoke, as though she were guiding him with silent strings. I noticed how her hand would brush against his, urging him forward, her confidence filling the space between us as much as his own arrogance. He asked me outright for control, saying that the family name depended on his leadership, that it was time for me to step aside and let him take his place. I sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words filling the air, and then I nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in patience, knowing that this was the boldness my lawyer had told me to wait for. He mistook my stillness for weakness, my quiet for surrender, and I let him believe it, for his belief would draw him even further into his own undoing. As he left that night, his shoulders high and his voice filled with pride, I remained seated at my desk, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. I did not feel anger in that moment, nor sorrow, but clarity. My son had revealed himself fully now, not with whispers or hidden papers, but with open demands spoken to my face. The mask had fallen, and the man who stood before me was no longer the son I remembered, but the reflection of his own greed. And in that truth, I knew the moment of reckoning was near. The day of reckoning came not by accident but by design. For with my lawyer I arranged a meeting that would appear ordinary to my son, yet would carry within it the weight of truth he could not escape. I told him we needed to sit together to discuss the future, and I made it sound as though I were finally ready to step aside, to give him the control he had long pressed me for. His voice over the phone carried eagerness, a sharp edge of triumph, and I could hear in his tone the certainty that victory was already his. We chose the setting carefully, not in my home but in my lawyer's office, a place he had visited before but never with such anticipation. I arrived early, sitting with my lawyer in the quiet room, the documents prepared, the evidence arranged, every detail in place. When my son entered, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world had bent to his will. His wife was at his side, her smile faint but certain, her eyes scanning the room as though measuring the value of every object. They both greeted me with a tone that carried courtesy but little warmth, their hands quick, their eyes restless. I remained calm, my face steady, my words measured as I invited them to sit. My lawyer began with pleasantries, his voice smooth, his manner professional, and I watched my son lean back in his chair, assured that this was only a formality before he received what he thought was already his. The room was silent, except for the lawyer's voice, the shuffle of papers, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I folded my hands on the table, my eyes fixed on my son, and waited as the moment approached. My lawyer shifted the papers, slid a folder across the desk, and began to speak not of inheritance, not of transition, but of attempted fraud, of manipulation, of signatures traced and documents altered. At first, my son smiled faintly, as though the words were smoke with no fire. But as the sentences continued, the smile began to fade. His wife leaned closer, her brow tightening, her lips pressing into silence, and I knew then that they understood the ground beneath them was not solid. It was a trap of their own making, and they had walked into it with eyes closed, believing they were stepping into triumph. I sat in silence as my lawyer unfolded the truth piece by piece, his voice calm and deliberate. The papers spread before us like a mirror that reflected every hidden act my son thought would never be seen. He pointed to the signatures, tracing them with his finger, showing where the ink revealed its imitation. He read aloud the altered clauses, his tone sharp with precision, explaining how each line shifted power in subtle ways that only careful eyes could uncover. My son's face, once bright with pride, began to stiffen. His posture shifted in his chair, his shoulders losing their height, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a way to deny what lay plain before him. His wife leaned forward, her hand on his arm, whispering something low, but even she could not mask the tremor in her voice. My lawyer continued without pause, presenting dates, correspondence, and the chain of requests that led back directly to my son's hand. Each page he turned was another weight laid on the table, another layer of deceit stripped away. I watched calmly, my hands resting on the wood, my eyes fixed on my son, not with anger but with a steadiness that came from knowing the truth no longer needed my voice. It spoke for itself. At last, my lawyer gathered the papers into a neat stack and said firmly that these actions carried consequence, that the law saw them for what they were, and that such attempts could not stand without judgment. The room fell into silence then, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint sound of the clock. My son tried to speak, his words stumbling, his voice uncertain, claiming misunderstanding. But my lawyer countered with evidence too precise to be dismissed. I remained still, watching as the mask of confidence crumbled, as the son I had raised faced the reflection of his own choices. His wife's eyes darted to me, searching for some softness, some sign of mercy, but I offered none, only the silence of a man who had already given enough. In that moment, I felt no need for shouting, no call for raised hands or sharp words. The truth itself had done what anger never could. It had stripped away every illusion, leaving only the raw weight of betrayal exposed in the open light. As the evidence lay heavy on the table, I watched my son's confidence collapse before my eyes. The arrogance that once filled his voice now broken into fragments of denial and weak protests. He shifted in his chair, his hands restless, his eyes darting between me and the lawyer as though searching for an escape that did not exist. He claimed ignorance at first, saying he had trusted others, saying mistakes must have been made without his knowledge, but the words carried no strength. for the papers told a story too precise to be denied. His wife leaned close, her whisper sharp in his ear, but even her presence could not steady him. She too sat stunned, her face pale, her lips pressed tight, her eyes no longer carrying the gleam of triumph they had once held. I could see her calculation falter, the quickness of her mind struggling to piece together a defense while the foundation beneath them crumbled. My son's denial grew louder, but with each word the weight of the evidence only pressed harder, and his voice cracked under the strain. I remained silent, letting him unravel, for silence itself was a mirror that forced him to hear his own weakness. At last, his anger began to rise, his hands slamming against the table, his voice shouting that I had betrayed him, that I had planned this to trap him, that I had never intended to give him what was his. Yet his words fell empty in the room, for it was not I who had brought this judgment upon him, but his own actions. His wife turned her gaze toward me then, her eyes narrowing as though hoping to find in me a sliver of mercy, but I gave her nothing. My heart was steady, my face calm, for I had no need to answer their rage. The truth had already spoken, and it was louder than any cry. I looked at my son and saw not the boy I had carried on my shoulders, not the young man I had guided through life, but a man undone by his own greed, stripped of the pride he once carried so high. His voice faltered into silence, his head lowering, his strength slipping away until all that remained was the hollow sound of defeat. In that moment I knew the mask had fallen forever, and the son I once believed in was gone. In the days that followed that meeting, the consequences began to fall with a weight neither my son nor his wife had prepared for, and I watched as the life they had built upon arrogance and ambition crumbled piece by piece. The lawyer moved swiftly, securing every document, filing the necessary actions, and ensuring that the law itself would guard what was mine. My son, once so certain of his control, found himself facing not wealth but legal walls too high to climb, each one reinforced by the very evidence he had created with his own hands. His accounts, once filled with the illusion of future riches, now stood hollow, the opportunities he thought he would seize slipping like sand through his fingers. Neighbors who had once greeted him with respect now whispered behind closed doors, for word of deceit travels quickly, and reputation is fragile when truth has been revealed. His wife, who once carried herself with poise and calculation, could no longer mask her unease. I saw her in public once, her smile strained, her voice thin, her steps hurried as though she wished to outrun the shadow of shame that now followed her. Invitations they once received began to dwindle, and the circle of friends who had fed their pride grew smaller with each passing week. Within their own home, tension grew, for ambition had bound them together, and now failure pulled them apart. My lawyer updated me often, his voice steady, his words precise, telling me how the legal process would strip away any false claims and restore the security I had built. I listened with patience, not rejoicing in their downfall, but accepting it as the natural end of choices they had made. Each action my son had taken left a mark, and now those marks stood against him, undeniable and clear. I carried on with my days as I always had, tending to my home, walking the grounds, remembering the years of labor that had given me all I had. The air felt lighter, not because the pain of betrayal had left me, but because justice had begun to take its rightful place. My son was left with nothing but the echo of his own choices. His power gone, his name clouded, his path uncertain. And though I did not celebrate his fall, I knew it was necessary, for without consequence there can be no lesson, and without truth there can be no peace. As the dust of consequence began to settle, I found myself reflecting not on the betrayal alone, but on the strength that had carried me through it. And in that reflection, I discovered a sense of vindication that filled me more deeply than wealth or victory ever could. For though the sting of my son's actions still lingered in my heart, I knew I had stood firm, I had defended what was mine, and I had not allowed deceit to undo the work of a lifetime. I walked through my home with a new steadiness, my eyes resting on the walls I had built, the fields I had tended, the photographs of family moments that had once been my only treasure, and I felt within myself a quiet peace that no betrayal could erase. I thought of the nights I had sat at my desk, with documents spread before me, my hand steady though my heart was heavy, and I realized that it was those moments of patience, not anger, that had delivered me here. My lawyer had been my ally, the law had been my shield, but it was my resolve, born from years of endurance, that had made the difference. I understood then that betrayal, though painful, is not the end of a story but the test that shapes its outcome. My son had underestimated me, believing age had weakened my mind, believing silence was surrender. Yet in truth, silence had been my greatest strength. It had allowed me to see clearly, to wait, to act with precision rather than haste, and when the time came, the truth spoke louder than any voice I could have raised. I no longer carried the same grief that once weighed me down, for grief had been replaced by clarity. I looked back at the sacrifices of my youth, the sweat of my labor, the long nights when I had worked so that my son could live with ease, and I knew that while he had turned from those values, they had never left me. They had carried me to this moment of justice, and in that justice I found peace. I could walk into the evening with my head high, not because I had triumphed over my son, but because I had remained true to myself, to the man I had always been. Vindication was not in his fall, but in my endurance, and in that endurance I had found my strength renewed. When all was said and done, I sat alone in the quiet of my home and let the weight of the journey settle upon me, not as a burden, but as a truth finally complete. My lawyer's call had been the spark, the words that opened my eyes to a betrayal I never wanted to see, yet through patience, planning, and resolve, I had turned that betrayal into triumph. My son had believed my silence was weakness, that my years had dulled my mind, but he had not understood that silence can be the strongest weapon, for it allows one to see clearly, to wait for the perfect moment, and to strike not with anger, but with certainty. He thought he could move in shadows, altering papers and weaving deceit, but the light of truth had caught him, and in that light his schemes had withered. I walked through the halls of my house, each step a reminder of what I had built, each photograph a reflection of sacrifices made, each stone in the wall a testament to years of labor that no deceit could erase. My legacy remained intact, guarded not only by the law, but by the strength I had carried through every trial of my life. I did not dwell on his downfall, for to do so would have been to give power to his choices. Instead, I dwelled on the lesson carved into my heart, that endurance, patience, and faith in truth are greater than any scheme born of greed. My son had underestimated me, but in doing so he had revealed himself, and in that revelation I found clarity. The story did not end in anger, nor in sorrow, but in calm certainty. I sat at my desk, the same desk where I had once spread the altered papers, and I felt peace settle over me, like the evening sun touching the horizon. I knew my legacy was safe, my name protected, my work preserved. What my son had tried to take would never be his, not through deceit, not through arrogance. The truth had triumphed. And as I leaned back in my chair, listening to the steady rhythm of the clock, I whispered to myself words I knew to be true. He had underestimated me, but he would never forget the strength of the Father who had turned silence into victory. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.